Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of Skepticism. Today, we're going to be discussing some of the themes that are expressed in Robert Audi's article on skepticism that hopefully you had a chance to read. If when you read the article you found it challenging, that's okay. It can be some of the even the very ideas of skepticism and of knowledge can be quite difficult and technical. So hopefully, after you've had a chance to either read it and perhaps listen to the lecture, we will have a better understanding of why studying skepticism is interesting or important and what it can reveal about the nature of knowledge. All right, so the first thing to consider is that sometimes when we say that we know something, we mean that we are certain of the thing that we know. And certainty might imply that you must know at the very least that you're not dreaming, right? Or that you're not hallucinating, right? So if you are right now probably watching this video, you might want to say, oh, I know that I'm watching a video of philosophy. And the skeptic or somebody might say, well, if you know that you're watching this lecture, then surely you know that you are not dreaming. To which you respond, yeah, I know that I'm not dreaming. Now, the skeptic may then ask you, well, how do you know that you're not dreaming? And you might laugh and be like, what are you talking about? Look, I can kind of see that I'm not dreaming. What do you want me to say? Like, I can feel, maybe you're sitting down at the library or your home, you can say I can feel the table, its texture very acutely. I can remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Like, what there are all these reasons why I know that I'm not dreaming. But then the skeptic may respond and say, well, isn't it possible that in your dreams you can feel things? And if reality is so vivid as you say it is, why is it that when you're dreaming you often don't realize that you're dreaming? If it's so obviously different when you're dreaming and not dreaming, why is it that when you're dreaming you often don't realize that you're dreaming? Right? And maybe you can respond and say, well, yeah, but sometimes I realize that I'm not dreaming and then I wake up, right? And so my ability to wake up kind of shows, I guess, that I'm not dreaming, right? And the fact that right now I cannot force myself to wake up shows that this is not a dream. Okay. Well, is that a good reason? Well, the skeptic might respond and say, well, and maybe, I don't know if this has been the case for you guys, but maybe have you ever not dream or were in a dream and then you realize perhaps you're in a dream and then you try to wake yourself up and you actually end up dreaming that you wake up in bed, but you're still dreaming? That's certainly happened to me, and maybe it's happened to you. The idea is that you can't, and this goes back to one of the themes, if you remember, from last Tuesday. If you remember on our previous lecture when we were talking about skepticism about methods or capacities, there is this inability for you to try to prove the reliability of your senses, which is what we're trying to prove when we're not dreaming, by using your own senses, right? It's circular because you can always, in a way, say that those sensible qualities could be dreamed up, right? And so that's kind of like, again, what's motivating skepticism, right? And we can formulate this argument in this way. And this is the way that Robert Audi formulates the argument. So if I know there's a spruce tree before me, and by spruce tree, think about like a Christmas tree. In fact, spruce trees are often used as Christmas trees in Europe, not so much in the US or Canada. But if I know that there's a spruce tree or Christmas looking tree before me, then I must know that I am not hallucinating or dreaming it, right? Because if you know that there's something in front of you, then surely you must know that you're not in a dream for you to know that. Because otherwise, if you don't know that you're not hallucinating or in a dream, then you can't really know that there's really a tree in front of you, right? But premise two says, but I do not know that I'm not hallucinating or dreaming, right? All the evidence that I seem to be drawing to suggest that I'm not dreaming or hallucinating cannot really prove that I am not hallucinating or dreaming. Therefore, I do not know that there's a spruce tree before me. And you can run this argument not only about a spruce tree, but about pretty much all of your empirical beliefs. Now, when Robert Audi or philosophers use the term empirical belief, they mean just beliefs are based on observations, like the fact that you're watching this video, the fact that you see there's a piano behind me, the fact that if you look around your, maybe again, if you're watching this from your room, the fact that you maybe see your bedroom or your closet, and so those are all empirical beliefs because they're based on observation. All right. Now, we talk, and again, this is in a way talking some of the same themes from Tuesday, right? So we can generalize this skepticism not only about perception, but about memory and belief and all other our methods of acquiring knowledge, rationality, and so forth. So we've actually already talked about this on Tuesday. So I'm going to skip this part. Now we're going to talk about the problem of induction, which again, we've kind of alluded to, but Robert Audi, I think, has a very nice formulation of it. Okay, so, well, let me start with the first premise. So the first premise of the skeptical argument from induction says that if inductive reasoning is valid, then true premises guarantee true conclusions, right? And remember, this is on Tuesday's lecture, we kind of alluded to this somewhat as soft, not soft, but modest skepticism, right? So this is the same idea. If inductive reasoning is valid, and then true premises guarantee true conclusions, right? So let's maybe pause it for a second and ask, well, what is inductive reasoning, right? Is inductive reasoning like deductive reasoning? If you guys remember from our first lecture on logic, we said that a deductive argument is valid if and only if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true, right? It's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, right? Remember, that's what we say was a valid argument. That preserves truth, and if we know that the premises are true, then we know by inference that the conclusion is also true. Now, inductive reasoning, is not like that, right? Inductive reasoning says, for example, suppose that you see a black raven, okay? So you see a black raven outside, then you see a second black raven, and a third, and a fourth black raven, and a fifth, and a sixth, and so on. Well, what do you conclude? Well, you conclude that all ravens are black, right? That's an inductive inference or inductive reasoning. But here's the problem with inductive reasoning, according to this argument. No matter how many instances of black ravens, my apologies, that you see, that can never guarantee the claim that all ravens are black, right? So if you have this in an argument like 1 through n number of ravens I've observed have been black, you can never then, that will never entail that therefore all ravens are black, right? It would be false to say that it's impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false, because it's not. It's possible that all of the ravens you've ever observed are in fact black, but it's possible that there could be a white raven, right? And that's just the nature of inductive reasoning, right? It's not supposed to be deductive. And so this argument again suggests that because it doesn't guarantee the conclusions, therefore there's room for uncertainty and therefore room for skepticism. So another way to think about this is about the fact that inductive inferences are always future oriented, right? That if you've seen something in the past many occasions, you begin to infer that that also will happen in the future, right? And but that there is really no reason for you to believe that, or so the skeptic wants to argue, right? So, for example, suppose that so suppose that I open the door behind me into the hall, and the moment I open it, suppose that you hear a bell, the sound of a bell. And you might think that's kind of strange, but you might not think any of it, right? And I close the door. And suppose that I open the door again, and as soon as I open it, you hear the sound of a bell again. Okay, second time, definitely strange. I close the door. Then I open it a third time, and right as I open it, you hear the sound of a bell. Now you begin to think, ooh, there must be some causal connection between the opening of the door and the sound of a bell. Maybe you imagine like some string or something being attached to some bell or something like that, right? But the reason why you begin to believe that is just because you have experienced the sequence of events. I open the door and you hear the bell. I open the door and you hear the bell. And now your mind begins to think, oh, there must be a causal relation there. But the only reason why you believe that, there's no causal relation for you to see. The only reason why you believe that is because you have experienced one after the other. And that was Hume's point. Hume says the only reason why we believe in causal relations, that things cause is certain other things, is because we have perceive them as constant conjunctions. That's what he calls them, and that's what we believe in causal relations. But there's no rationality behind it. There's no reason behind it. And so, why do you believe that the sun will rise tomorrow? Are you justified in believing that the sun rise tomorrow? I'm sure many of you believe it, but do you know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, Hume and the problem of induction would say, no, you don't actually know that. Just because you've seen it in the past does not mean that it's going to happen in the future. There's no guarantee. There's no validity, right? And so this is the problem. And we're going to actually spend a lot of time thinking about this problem in a couple of weeks, especially within the context of science and methods in science. But for now, we can see this as a challenge of skepticism. So the problem of other minds, as Robert Audi discusses it, is actually just an application of the problem of induction. So it's not a different skeptical argument, it's just an application of the problem of induction with respect to other minds. So how did this argument go? Premise 1 says, my beliefs about other mental states, for example, Jesus is angry, are based on inductive reasoning from behavior. What does that mean? Well, have you ever thought about the fact that you cannot perceive other people's mental states? You can only perceive your own. What mental states am I talking about? Any mental state, like your feelings of pain, of anger in this example, of sadness, feelings of elation. Whatever feelings or mental states you want to talk about, you have never perceived them and are not capable of perceiving them in other people. You've only perceived yourself, your own. So what warrants you in believing that other people have similar experiences and therefore minds? Because really, that's what makes a mind. It's the mental states. Well, you might say, well, I can tell because of how people behave. And you would be right. That's the main reason why we believe that other people have mental states like ours, right? So if I come and sit here and suppose I was to just like bump myself onto my desk and I kind of start like, maybe not crying, but, grimacing or, making faces, you would say, oh, Daniel is feeling pain, right? And why would you be able to believe that? Because normally that kind of behavior is associated with the state of pain or sadness, right? But if you notice, this is just an instance of induction, right? In the past, you've seen that certain kinds of behaviors seem to be associated with certain kinds of mental states, especially if you think about your own mental states. But you've never seen actually other people's mental states, right? And so this is just your belief that other people have minds or mental states is based on inductive reasoning. But premise 2, we just saw from our previous argument that inductive reasoning does not entail the truth to the conclusion. Your belief that other people have minds is not any more warranted than the belief that I described earlier about there being a bell causally related to my door just because you heard the bell after the door. It's the same. It's just a habit of the mind to say that there's a causal relation just because we've seen that sequence in that order, right? Or so, again, Hume and skeptics would say. So therefore, this is an assumption or a necessary premise of this argument. If my evidence does not entail the conclusion, I cannot know the conclusion, right? From which it follows that therefore I cannot know what is in the minds of others. So again, this is an application of the more general problem of induction. Okay, so how does Robert Audi respond to these kinds of arguments? And it's and again, if you were able to read it, you might have found it difficult, so we'll try to go over it very slowly. So he calls these skeptical arguments, he thinks that these skeptical arguments are ultimately based on this idea of fallibility, or infallibility, to be more precise. He thinks that ultimately these arguments rest on something like the infallibility principle that says, if you know something, you cannot be wrong. Okay? If you know something, you cannot be wrong. Now, if you kind of reflect on this principle, I mean, it kind of sounds right in a way, right? Like, if you really know something, you cannot be wrong. Because otherwise, in what sense do you know it, right? Like, when we say we know, I am sure I know something, there seems to be a force of something like an infallibility idea, right? And so this is the way this is the way that these arguments are structured. Premise 1 is an infallibility principle. If you know something, you cannot be wrong. Premise 2, though, is that you can be wrong about some introspective belief, or quite frankly, any kind of belief. Forget introspective. Introspective is just from introspection. Like, you can introspect about what you believe. Like, for example, right now I can introspect and believe that my spouse is working at the hospital because that's where she works. But it can be any belief. It can be the belief that there's a tree outside. It can be belief that I'm recording a lecture right now. It can be any belief. So again, premise 1, if you know something, you cannot be wrong. Premise 2, but you can be wrong about some belief. Therefore, that belief is not knowledge. So this is the basic structure of all of these arguments, right? All right. So here's a strategy which Robert Audi espouses and which we're going to do. He argues that premise number one is ambiguous. Now, what does it mean for something to be ambiguous? It's not vague. It's that its meaning, or at least the way that we're using this here, is when a phrase or proposition or word is ambiguous, is that it could have multiple meanings, right? And so Robert Audi says that the infallibility principle is ambiguous. It can have different meanings, and the reason why it seems appealing is because we're conflating all of these meanings. And moreover, he's going to argue, look, all the interpretations that seem more plausible or to be correct, we will realize that the conclusion doesn't actually follow. And on the interpretation where the argument does follow, it's not actually as plausible as one might think. So what are the different interpretations of the infallibility principle? Well, here is the first interpretation. So maybe by the infallibility principle, that is, if you know something, you cannot be wrong, maybe what the skeptic means is that if you know that P, then P must be true, right? And you can see how that's a plausible interpretation of this infallibility principle, right? If you know something, then you cannot be wrong. So if you know that P, then P must be true. Like, that sounds like it's very similar, and this is one, and this is the verite principle. So that principle, is that true? Is that principle true? That if you know that P, then P must be true? I think we discussed this on Tuesday, actually, if I remember correctly. Yes, it is true. You can only, if you know that P, then P is true. Or they're saying that P being true is a necessary condition of you knowing that P, right? Or to put it another way, you can only know true things. You can only know facts. But you might say, wait, no, but can somebody know something false? And I've had many students who sometimes seem to find that idea compelling, but when you really think about it, it just doesn't make sense for you to know something that is false. Like, for example, suppose that somebody says, I know that there are 55 states in the US, in America. Can somebody really know that there are 55 states? Well, no, right? Why can't they know that? Because it's not an actual fact, right? It's not a fact that there are 55 states, right? So it's incoherent, perhaps, to say that you can know falsehoods, because it seems like you can only know truths. That's what this is saying. So it's true, but what? Does that mean that the skeptical argument then is valid or good? Well, no. Adi says, but this is, even though there's a sense in which is a sense of infallibility, that you only know truths, this premise does not actually imply skepticism. Like, what is it about me knowing that everything that I know has to be true? Or let's put it in terms of the argument, right? So if by premise one we mean the veritas principle, then now we interpret you can be wrong as false, right? So if you know something, then it must be true. And you can be wrong about some introspective belief, therefore that introspective belief is not knowledge. That doesn't follow, right? Because I can be wrong about some introspective belief, but I only know facts, right? That's what the veritas principle says, right? It only says that if I do know something, then it has to be true. That has nothing to do whether could be wrong about some belief, right? So that interpretation does not allow us, or it does not allow the skeptic to conclude the skeptical conclusion, right? Okay, so veritas principle, as Robert Audi says, is trivially true. That means it's true, but it's trivial. It doesn't actually support any skeptical conclusions. Okay, here's another interpretation of the infallibility principle, which says if you know something, you cannot be wrong. Maybe that means if you know that P, then P must be necessarily true. Ooh, okay. So one says that if you know that P, then P is true. This one says if you know that P, then P must be necessarily true. Well, what does it mean for something to be necessarily true? So it means that it's not possible for it to be false, right? So let's think about some examples. Is it possible that there's a tree outside my house? So is it necessarily true, to put it mildly, that there's a tree outside my house? Is that necessarily true? Or is it possible that there is no tree outside my house? Now you might say, well, Daniel, how am I supposed to know? I can't see outside your house. But you actually don't need to see inside my house, or rather see outside my house through my room, for you to be able to answer this question. Is it possible that there's no tree outside my house? Of course it is. Because somebody could have come and cut it down. Maybe for all I know, it's possible my spouse got tired of this tree and she ordered somebody to cut it down. Or maybe the government ordered, like, it's obviously possible that there could be felt to be a tree outside my house. Is it possible? What about something like, is it necessarily true that I exist or that you exist? Is it necessarily true that you exist? Well, no, right? It's possible that you could have not existed. It's possible that your parents could have failed to meet, and so on and so forth, right? Or let me put it in terms of maybe religious terms, because sometimes that's useful, or in terms of theistic beliefs. It's possible that God didn't have to create you if you believe in God, right? So obviously it's possible for you to have failed to exist. Okay, so if all of those are not necessarily true, then what are true beliefs? Well, what are necessarily true statements or beliefs, or things that must be true necessarily? Well, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true, and it seems like it's necessarily true, right? It doesn't seem like it's possible for 2 plus 2 not to equal 4. So there's a necessary truth. Likewise, truths of geometry also seem to be necessarily in that sense. What about non-mathematical examples? Well, if you believe in God, then God would seem to be a candidate for being a necessary being. That means it was not possible for God to not exist. And this is what is often called God's aseity, that by his own very nature he must exist. But he'd be probably the exception compared to most other beings, right? Or perhaps more or less controversially, the statement all bachelors are unmarried men is also necessarily true. Think about it. Is it possible for there to be a bachelor who is not an unmarried man? No, it's not possible, because by definition, right? Bachelors just are unmarried men, right? All right, so this is saying, if this is what the infallibility principle says, if this is what they mean by it, then essentially what they're saying is that if you know that P, then P must be necessarily true. Or to put it another way, the only kinds of truths that you can know are necessary truths, says the skeptic on this interpretation. What does Robert Audi say about this? Well, he actually says that seems false. That's not true that we can't, or that we can only know necessary truths. Consider the following two. These are contingent truths. So before I jump into the examples, just some semantics, I guess. There are necessary truths, which must be necessarily true, and then there are contingent truths. That means they could have failed to be true. And here are some examples which Robert Audi gives of truths that are contingent, but that we're really sure that we believe or that we know. What's the first one? I exist? Wait, but Daniel, you said that I exist, that I didn't have to exist, that it's a contingent fact that I exist. That's true, but here's what this is saying. It's actually the belief that I exist. When you utter the belief, and maybe you can do this with me right now, say, I exist. When you say you believe, express the belief that you exist, that has to be true because there has to be somebody who is doing the believing, right? And so in that sense, everyone can know that they exist, right? Because by expressing the belief, there's somebody who must exist, and that is you, right? Even if it's true that you could have failed to exist, right? We're not saying that you necessarily exist. We're just saying that it seems to be part of your very belief. The fact that you believe makes it the case that you exist, and therefore you know it, right? And the same idea would be, it appears that there's a tree before me. Obviously, I'm not going to assume here that I know that there's a tree, because the skeptic is going to say, no, but how do you know that you're not hallucinating? That's true, I don't know, but what I do know is that it seems as if there's a tree in front of me, and the skeptic can't deny that. The skeptic can deny, you don't know if there's a real tree. Again, sure, but it seems to me like there's a tree in front of me. I know that at least it seems. And so these are just counterexamples to the necessity principle. There are kinds of beliefs, kind of, that are made true by the very fact that we believe them and that we know them to be the case, and that make them contingent, and therefore they falsify or serve as counterexamples to the necessity principle. Okay? All right, so those don't work. So what the only interpretation of the infallibility argument that seems to be able to work is the idea that if you know that P, then your believing it must entail this truth, right? We just discussed 2 examples of that kind. So that must be what the skeptic must mean by infallibility. They must mean that the only kinds of beliefs that you can know are the kinds of beliefs that are entailed, the truth of which are entailed by your very belief states, like the belief that I exist and the belief that it seems like there's a tree in front of me. And that would seem to capture what the skeptic wants to say, right? That you cannot know that there's a real tree over there. You can only know that there seems to be a tree there, right? You cannot really know that that you're watching a lecture, but you can know that it seems like you're watching a lecture, right? So that seems to be ultimately what the skeptic believes, right? So here is this is the argument in that form. So only beliefs that cannot be false count as knowledge, right? Some beliefs, for example, I exist, I have a belief, are infallible in this sense, right? In the sense in which now we're thinking about this argument, right? We're thinking about it in this sense. If you know that P, then your belief that P is infallible, i.e. believing it entails its truth. This is the formulation that the skeptic needs for their argument to make sense, right? For example, some beliefs, like I exist, or I have a belief, or there seems to be a tree in front of me, are infallible in this sense. But most empirical beliefs, like I actually think there's a tree there, or you actually think you're actually watching a lecture, are fallible, right? You're believing that you're watching a lecture does not make it true that you're watching a lecture, right? That's different. And therefore, most ordinary beliefs cannot count as knowledge. So this is the formulation. So this fallibility principle, that believing it entails its truth, is the fallibility principle that the skeptic must have in mind for their argument to work. But here is ultimately Robert Audi's response. And it's kind of like a twofold response. So he says, remember that I said that the skeptical argument's ambiguous, right? Between various interpretations. And what makes the argument seem appealing is really that verity principle, right? But once you remove that and you end up with just this principle, believing in it tells its truth, it just doesn't seem that plausible. Or to put it another way, so let me just put this here. The skeptic uses the ambiguity of one and the seeming plausibility of 1 and 2, but they need actually 3, right? So they need this interpretation, but really it's not that plausible. So here's the way that I like to think about this, or in the way that I think ultimately Robert Audi thinks about this. So one way to think about beliefs in general is you shouldn't really think about beliefs as you either believe something or you don't. That's too coarse-grained. Because we don't really just believe something or we don't, right? We believe things to different degrees. So suppose you assign a degree, like a number, to your beliefs, right? Depending on how certain you are. Let's say 1 to 10. So for example, how certain are you that you're listening to my lecture at this very second? In a scale 1 to 10. Probably, I say most would probably say 10. I'm fairly certain, right? How many people are certain that it's going to rain tomorrow? And maybe you looked up the weather and it says 50% chance that it rains tomorrow. So you're going to go, I don't know, 5 out of 10. Okay. How many of you are sure that you put your computer in your backpack before you went to campus? And again, people would say, I'm pretty sure I did. And you might say 9. Now, you might be tempted to say 10, but remember, 10 is your absolute certainty, like your highest level, like the way that you believe that you're listening to me right now. Like, that's a 10. Your memory can be hazy, right? Maybe you thought you did. I mean, it's fairly reliable, but, 9, not quite 10, right? And so we have all of these beliefs that we assign credence levels, right? Like the belief that I can see a tree outside, and most of our empirical beliefs that make up common sense, we assign high credence, like 9 or 10, right? And so the question that Robert Audi ultimately asks is why should we not believe our common sense, but instead believe this principle? Like, think about this principle. If you know that P, then you believe that P is infallible in the sense that it tells its truth. How much credence do you guys assign to that principle? Like how much credence, how much belief in a scale of 1 to 10 do you assign to that? I don't know. If you find this very compelling, maybe if like that, and again, think about what it's saying, that for you to know that P, it must be infallible in the sense that your belief wouldn't tell its truth. That's the only way that you know something. And you probably would say, I don't know, maybe if you find this very compelling, maybe 7, maybe 8 at most. But then if that's the case, why believe this principle as opposed to all your other empirical beliefs, all of your common sense beliefs, right? Like, you have so many beliefs, common sense beliefs about the world, then why would you instead espouse this skeptical argument? It's true that the veriti principle sounds really plausible. If the skeptical argument, like I would assign the veriti principle a 10, if the skeptic's argument actually could work with the veriti principle, then yes, maybe then you should reconsider your ordinary empirical beliefs. But as Robert Audi, I think, correctly shows, it is not the veriti principle on which this argument rests, but rather this much more controversial principle. And as such, instead, we should just believe our common sense. And common sense says that we do know all of these things around us. All right, so we'll end it there, and then for next week, we're going to talk more about the nature of knowledge, and we're going to talk about whether knowledge is justified true belief or something else. All right, well, I'll see you then.